Not like other girls is one of the stupidest tropes that has ever existed. And through discussions about the problems with it, it has allowed for us to really critically engage not only with the stories that we saw it present within, whether they be books, movies, TV shows, whatever it was. In critically engaging with this, it allowed for us to understand our own society. It held up a mirror to some of the views that were prevalent at the time that this was very popular, and then we were able to grow from that, so much so that we have essentially eliminated that trope altogether. It's an impressive feat considering that miscommunication is dreaded, and it's still pretty common in a lot of books. But Not Like Other Girls was so useless that to compare it once again to miscommunication, at the very least, miscommunication does at times serve a purpose. It shows the way that human beings oftentimes are not really hearing each other, or they're not even bothering to try communicating. And even though it can be frustrating, especially when used poorly, other times it can really illuminate the ways in which we have a hard time meeting each other where we are. Other times miscommunication makes sense if we're talking about a historical setting in which there's propriety and people aren't always able to say what they mean because there's other people around and they have to try to convey what they're feeling with a very minimal amount of words. Thus, there are ways to use even that dreaded trope in some fashion so as to further understand our own tendencies as human beings. Not Like Other Girls, though, is something that was so dumb that we hardly ever see it these days. That said, I do think that the criticism of Not Like Other Girls, while very, very fairly applied and dissected, has at times transformed into something that can hurt and maybe even go against a lot of the growth that we could have if we were to maybe take a step back from just applying that term and actually sat and analyze what certain books are aiming for. As a result, I wanted to not necessarily just do a deep dive, but rather a retrospective and a look back at this trope, dissect its origins, how it started, how we got to a point where we kind of collectively all decided that this is really stupid, but then also where maybe we went too far with it, and why at times the concept of this trope actually could still, in the same way I was talking about miscommunication, there are instances where perhaps we are miscategorizing what we're actually seeing within certain stories. Before jumping into it, a big thank you though to Eloriel for working with me on today's video. Eloriel is a new fantasy romance and romantasy-centered book box where readers can choose from 3 special edition selections each month. All books are limited exclusive hardback editions that sell out really quickly. July and August books sold out almost immediately. But even with how popular the books are, I think it's great that Eloriel is flexible and gives you the option to skip a month if something doesn't catch your eye, penalty free. You can get your first book for $14.99 using the code TRUELOVE, and this month they'll be offering up to $30 off of a gifting membership with the code LOVE in case you'd like to give somebody a year of Eloriel for Valentine's Day. And this month you'll get a free gift, one of Eloriel's 3 hats. As for the books themselves, we have Half City, a chosen one enemies to lovers romantasy following a monster hunter who lives in a city that once served as a gateway to hell. After that, we have The Lies That Summon the Night, which is set in a world where art is forbidden and shadows hunt those who create it, a fact that proves dangerous for the storyteller Inanna. Last, we have Heart's Gambit, a sweeping love story about sacrifice, power, and impossible love. Thanks again, of course, to Eloriel for working with me. Now on to today's video. Though I likely don't really need to elaborate as to what this was and how it started, I still think it's important to do so that we can kind of full circle understand where we've ended up by analyzing where we started. The Not Like Other Girls trope, for those of you who were lucky enough to never really engage with it or see it in the stories that you picked up, was the idea that a character's value, and oftentimes desirability if we're referring to romantic interests, and oftentimes we were with this particular trope, it's the idea that their desirability and their value is based in how much they are not like other girls or not like other women. In a moment, we'll get into the specific traits that are the things that are defining factors between basic girls and the oftentimes protagonist who isn't like other girls. But before we dive into those, it's important to note the difference between not like other girls versus a character being exceptional. Exceptional characters can fall, of course, into 2 extremes or somewhere in the middle. They can be very, very boring because they're just good at everything, and it doesn't ever feel like the stakes matter because the character will just overcome them purely because they are just so exceptional. And then you have characters who are inspiring, who make you want to genuinely be a better person, who make you question yourself. And they do so because they are willing to sacrifice a lot, because they've endured so much, but they persevere through it. Or maybe sometimes exceptionalism can actually show the ways in which everyday average people are actually all unique and exceptional because of all the little things that go unnoticed or unappreciated about them. A poorly executed exceptional character oftentimes is correctly identified as being a Gary Sue or a Mary Sue. They are uninteresting, they're not compelling, they make the story very predictable, and they are, of course, characters that other characters fawn over, because why wouldn't they? They're just so perfect. So not only do they overcome everything, but also everybody is drawn to them, and it doesn't feel like anything you can connect with or relate to, and it becomes actually, if anything, kind of annoying. However, a very well executed, exceptional character, they still have flaws. There are still things about them that they have to push through. However, they oftentimes are incredibly inspiring. They genuinely fill you with hope for mankind. They make you be introspective, and they make you question, would I even be willing to do that? And it's really wonderful when you find characters like that. Maybe it's not your favorite kind of character, but it can be done in a way so as to not necessarily fall under the cliche of the Mary Sue or Gary Sue. This is very different, though, than what we're describing when we say not like other girls. Not like other girls aren't women who happen to be exceptional, because obviously being exceptional means that you are exceptional across the board, regardless of gender. Rather, not like other girls, there are specific traits where you are saying, hey, these traits are typically associated with women. They're typically seen as feminine traits. And we think feminine traits are stupid. So when you act in a way that is different from those things, you are therefore better than those other girls who are concerned with frivolous things, which is where we get into what are the specific traits that they supposedly are defined against. One of the first traits that is a pretty big giveaway oftentimes is if other characters are noting that the woman in this scenario isn't high maintenance. There's an idea, sometimes implied or sometimes just said overtly, that women who take any time for any form of self-care are somehow very self-absorbed. Even in stories where you will have male counterparts to these characters engaging in cleanliness, self-grooming, fashion, they can be concerned about those things and it's seen as taking care of themselves. It can be seen as a positive thing. But then when the other characters are doing it, then it's seen as frivolous and stupid, trivial, and shallow. A perfect example in a book that I picked up recently, there was a character who somebody said, hey, we need to travel and I need you to pack quickly and I need you to pack light. So she did. And then the male character was astounded because they said, wow, you packed light. And she responded, well, you told me to pack light. And he said, it's just most of the women I know would have so much more luggage and they don't really listen. But I guess you're not like that, are you? Okay, good job. She's exceptional and you're in love with her because she packed light, and women typically don't do that. It's oftentimes very, very, very basic. And it's not about compatibility. It's not like, oh, thank you, I really appreciate that you respected what I was saying because we are kind of in a hurry. It's other women wouldn't have done this in this way. Thank you for not being like other women. And also this oftentimes creates, and we saw this happen in a lot of the people who read stories growing up that were saying these things, it creates a lot of confusion for people because you should take care of yourself to the best of your abilities, and it's good to try and express yourself in ways that you feel truly represent you, that you feel comfortable with, and also cleanliness and hygiene are good things. And it is confusing because you want to smell nice, you want to be clean, you want to look presentable, you don't want to feel like a slob, but then these characters are supposedly just like waking up and they're beautiful and they're perfect, and it kind of reinforces this idea that to take any amount of care in yourself is somehow shallow. You should just be hot naturally. And naturally hot also is this unattainable standard that's not even accurate, because then when you'll see adaptations of stories that contain these types of characters, the characters are 100% having hair extensions or blowouts with their hair. They have false lashes. They have lip liner. They clearly work out a ton. It's not like they just rolled out of bed and were these perfect, quote-unquote, conventionally attractive characters. An example of this sort of behavior is somebody like Adolin from the Stormlight Archive. If you don't know anything about this character, he is A character that likes to express himself through his fashion. However, he is restricted because he often has to wear a uniform and abide by certain codes for uniformity's sake. But he gets frustrated by this because he likes being able to wear the clothes that he likes. And he also doesn't have a tendency to pack light whenever they're going to on some kind of quest, some kind of important journey. He often wants to bring way more things than perhaps are necessary. And when you have that same exact behavior in a character that is a female character, I think very understandably a lot of people were able to dissect, hey, wait a second, there's a difference between how people are responding to this character and how people are responding to this one within the context of their stories. With that character, sometimes the level of packing, as an example, characters would be like, we probably can't lug all of this around, so we might have to take a few things out. Or maybe, yes, you want to express yourself, which is fine in certain situations, but other times, because you are a soldier, you do have to try and fit with other individuals also. So there would be times where they would talk about it in that way, but they weren't criticizing the very act of wanting to express himself a certain way. It was more of sometimes this just doesn't fit the circumstances. Whereas in other types of stories, the characters around that one, that would be an example of a character you do not want to be like if you are a female character. Also fitting in with this is often a level of intelligence. Characters that are more studious or academically driven are automatically seen as better than other girls. And usually there is some kind of the character being told, wow, you're not like other girls because you actually care about important things. And intelligence was usually very narrowly defined as being good at very specific things, often things that are prioritized in academic settings. Then they were seen as better than, and it's kind of this dismissiveness towards the traits that are typically associated with the other female characters. And then oftentimes the one that is the most hypocritical in nature was the concept of interest in men or sexual promiscuity. So if there were female characters who were boy crazy, we'll say, those characters were seen as ridiculous and childish, whereas the character that was more mature and refined was because they weren't concerned with those sorts of things. And the reason I say that this was very hypocritical is because the very idea of being separate from those other women was often framed through how desirable you are to a romantic love interest. It's still rooted in everybody defining themselves based off of how the male characters think of them as better. For a long time, these sorts of things within stories were a little bit more subtle, and it got to a point where suddenly it wasn't subtle at all, and it was just directly stated. There's a reason why this is called Not Like Other Girls, because that exact phrase was being applied in stories all the time. And as I've kind of said already, and I'm on repeat in saying, a lot of times it was said by the love interest of the story. And sometimes you would even have the cheating trope, where a character would be with a girl or a woman, depending on the age of the characters. They would be in a relationship with somebody, and then the main character was not like that other girl, and that other girl represented everything wrong with women. She liked to care about her appearance, and maybe she was interested in things that weren't deemed important, and thus when the character who is in a relationship with her, the guy in the situation, when he would naturally develop feelings for this perfect, wonderful, not like other girls girl, it was almost deemed justified, because why should we feel bad that he isn't into this other girl and that he's even going as far as to potentially cheat on her? Why should we care? Because she sucks anyway, right? Because she represents everything we don't like about women. And oftentimes, when we actually took a step back and analyzed it, we're like, she didn't do anything. She's just existing as a person. And if he's not attracted to that, if it's not a compatible person for him, then he should call it off. And it was just, I think, the cheating trope that started to really make people look at the way that the female characters would be seen as hero and villain purely based off of their vying for attention from the male character, and how awful that was, because it's awful for everyone involved. It's not how people should feel or behave. And so a lot of times people growing up were seeing these sorts of things in media and were starting to really question, wait a second, why should I be made to feel bad because of the things that I do that don't harm anybody else and that make me feel like an individual, or that define me in this time? And just because something is viewed as good at that time for a specific gender, also, we'll add, doesn't mean that that's even going to last. So an interesting twist that has occurred, if we're doing this as a retrospective, is that we now see characters that have kind of become final form of the Not Like Other Girls, where Not Like Other Girls has turned characters into oftentimes what we saw from a lot of male characters. They're really strong, they're really stoic, they're really good at fighting, and of course you can have really amazing characters that are women that fit all of those descriptions, but now we're seeing this pushback where what happened to the soft character? What happened to the one that was lovely and sweet and kind? What happened to those characters? And we're like, well, those characters used to be the ones that got cheated on in the stories for not being cool enough and not being tough enough and not being low maintenance enough, and then you created that kind of character and suddenly she's too hard. The pendulum essentially swung so far the other direction that now we're criticizing characters for not being feminine enough. Very understandably, there has been a lot of conversations that have occurred over how female characters are written. One, because sometimes they were just accessories to other characters and they didn't have any substance. They were just there to be leered at. They were just there to be ogled and to be hot. And they didn't really have a lot of substance. So understandably, a lot of people criticized that kind of representation of female characters. Then we got everything we're discussing today, the character that she maybe in some ways did represent a lot of girls, because sometimes other girls growing up, they didn't feel like they connected with the things that were common with girls of their generation or girls they went to school with. They felt separate from them. And then so sadly, they almost saw themselves in these characters that were defined by their differences from other girls. But rather than just feeling seen for once, it went beyond that to, you are better than those other people. And I think for a while, a lot of people then started to elevate themselves, and it carried into adulthood, unfortunately, as well. And it's something that people are having to even still disentangle. But there were a lot of individuals who looked at that, realized, wait a second, I don't mind characters feeling seen for being different, but they shouldn't be valued as better than for their differences, unless the story is about a bunch of people that are genuinely horrible people. But the framing that women just existing are less than the other women who are different from them, and there is almost that idea of like I said in the cheating trope of, well, she kind of deserved it. It's fine. It's even romantic because he recognized how frivolous and silly she is and how great this other girl is. So a lot of people pushed back against that, realized, hey, that's not how we should be looking at our female characters. That is doing a lot of harm, in fact. We've also had some characters that when they are soft, when they are kind, they're seen as weak. And oftentimes, even when you have mother characters, and the mother characters, a lot of their life is defined by motherhood. Not that they should solely be defined by motherhood, but it, of course, requires a lot of their time and attention, and they care very deeply for their children. A lot of times they're seen as frustrating characters because even if it's done well, there is this annoyance that so much of their life is centered around their children, and people have a lot to say about that. And then you also have the characters that are tough and gruff and cool and fighters, and they get criticized for not being soft enough. And so there's a pattern of consistently taking issue and really analyzing female characters, sometimes in a way that is helpful and productive, other times in a way where it feels like there is just no such thing as a female character that's ever going to be well written, because we are all projecting onto these characters our own biases. We're projecting onto them what we want them to be, or sometimes if we are reminded even a little bit of other people that mistreated us when we were younger, or that we felt have mistreated us even recently, then we just immediately latch onto that, and then we hate those characters. And where I think it's kind of interesting, and this is of course anecdotal, but I have done a couple of videos where we discuss frustrations with how female characters are written and frustrations with how male characters are written, and by far the one about female characters had a lot more attention to it and a lot more opinions than the one about male characters. And I just think it's very interesting that there are certainly things to criticize and there are certainly things to push back against, but it can feel like we are open to that dialogue when it comes to female characters, and then when it comes to male characters, sometimes even when you are pushing back against something, especially in classic fantasy or older works, it doesn't get received quite in the same way. And so in a lot of ways, the deconstructing of these tropes, I think the openness to do that maybe speaks to our openness to deconstruct our own behaviors in real life as well. Which leads us into the overuse of the label of not like other girls, because there are instances where tying this all back to the concept of miscommunication, there are actually on occasion times when Not Like Other Girls is not necessarily presented quite in this negative fashion that we've been talking about for a lot of this video. There are times where Not Like Other Girls, while the label applies, it's not necessarily being done in a way so as to dismiss anything to do with femininity or female characters at large. And part of the reason I wanted to distinguish the difference between Not Like Other Girls and exceptionalism in a character is because I think in a lot of ways this is where these can go hand in hand and be done in a way that is actually speaking to a lot of our own problems in the real world, in the past, and also it can shape how maybe we are able to go forward. It's a very fine line though. It's very difficult to accomplish, which is why when people have used this label in a somewhat dismissive way of certain works, I understand where they're coming from and I know why there is that knee-jerk reaction, because it is frustrating to only define people against others in this very unfair way. But there are certain times where I think if we really dig deep into the literature we're consuming and we are critically engaging with it, we realize that maybe it's saying something a little bit deeper than just the shallowness that oftentimes we associate with this trope. For example, if we're looking at something that's historical fiction, and there is a set way in which life is expected to play out for certain groups of people, and in the case of this trope, these certain groups of people are women, but you can actually extrapolate this and apply it to a lot of different kinds of stories. But if we're seeing characters who are maybe in historical settings oppressed in some fashion, and there is a character that is kind of pushing back against what is expected of them, naturally that would separate them from a lot of other people who just sometimes so badly don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to risk their lives. They don't want to risk other people's lives. They just as much as possible want to enjoy what they do have. That is very understandable. And when you have a character that recognizes and understands that, and they completely see why somebody wouldn't want to put themselves in danger, but they themselves, they just aren't okay with the way that so many people are trapped within a certain kind of life, and thus they don't want to continue to fall in line. They might push back against those things. That naturally does make them different and makes them not like other characters. In fact, you might even have another character use that phrase in some fashion. You're not like anybody I've ever met before. You might hear them say something like that. And maybe even it would go as far as to be something that someone not only respects, but is attracted to. Maybe they are attracted to what is basically like a revolutionary type of character. And it doesn't have to be I lead the revolution by literally marching soldiers to the walls. It doesn't have to necessarily be that. It could be quiet ways in which characters are pushing back against what's expected of them. And if a character finds that attractive, I don't think that they're necessarily saying, I'm attracted to you because you're better than all these other people. It could be that they are genuinely drawn to the fighter in that person, the individual that wants to resist, the person that wants to progress forward. However, the distinction in this scenario versus what we've seen of this trope in the past is that in this scenario, the character has an understanding that it is easier to fall in line. And they might even respect characters who are able to withstand for the sake of their children, for the sake of their families, for the sake of their friends. They will endure the hardships they've been placed within. They will endure the lack of agency in their own life if it means safety for those around them. And that in its own way, the character that we're describing as, in this instance, Not Like Other Girls, that character might actually respect that life and think, I couldn't do it. I think it would be easier in some ways, but for me it would be harder, and I don't want to have to live that way. And maybe they even reckon with, am I selfish for not wanting to sacrifice in order to make things easier for other people around me? Am I actually selfish? Or am I brave for pushing back against these things and having that conflict in the characters? I think that's the key difference. It's not a matter of I'm looking down at other people who are also experiencing hardships because of oppression in some way. It's not that these two characters or groups of characters are against each other. It's that they recognize that they are all victims of their circumstances, and the real thing they're pushing back against is societal norms. The real thing they're pushing back against is maybe some kind of actual oppressor or villain or antagonist. In the case of the romantic angle, because that is so present oftentimes with the Not Like Other Girls trope, as I was saying before, sometimes there are characters who they start to also have their eyes open to the injustices going on around them. And they also don't dismiss all the people who are looking for that safety. They don't dismiss them, but they do respect that this other person is pushing back, and maybe it even leads them to want to move forward and to create progress for these other people. And sometimes it can be in quiet ways, similar to the thing that they're drawn to about the character, or maybe that they can actually use their position of privilege. If we are talking about historical settings where perhaps the male characters have more power, you might even see these characters now doing what they can so as to make things more available to the character that they are respecting, or the character that they are even in love with. And while I'm using the example of historical fiction, this is present within fantasy works, this is present within sci-fi, this is present within all sorts of genres, and it also can be applicable to things to do with present day. And I think it's really important in scenarios like these that we don't just quickly label this as not like other girls and talk about it in a flippant way, because actually what it's saying is that it is powerful to want to do what you can if you have the means. It is powerful to have a character trying to make things better for everyone around them, and if that means maybe they do live life a little bit differently than other people, that, again, in the case of Not Like Other Girls, in the case of being different than other women, it's not that they hold themselves above other women. And if that's true, and if that's shown within the work of fiction, then in that instance, I think it's important to not just dismiss this. It can actually be really, really powerful. It can show the ways in which a lot of times quietly resistance can actually happen. Also, a completely different avenue in which this can be utilized in a way that is important is if you have a character doing the opposite of what I was just talking about. You have a character that genuinely thinks of themselves as better, and it is a story of reflection. It's a story of how they have been fed something time and time again, and as a result, they believed it, they held to it, they defined themselves by it, and then perhaps over time, they start to realize, oh wait, I don't agree with this. In the same way that we did collectively against this trope, sometimes it's good to have characters that do that, because no matter the situation, there are so many things that we are oblivious to. There's so many things that if we were to look back at ourselves in 10, 15 years, there are things that we would look at about ourselves now and think, how did I ever think that that was okay? And you just don't see it until you really start to do that deep reflection. So when you have stories where that reflection is happening, even though it can be frustrating, and even though it can be grating, and it can feel like a lot of what we very much pushed back against for so long with our stories, it's important to actually meet the work where it is and actually see what it's trying to convey. There are a number of reasons that I wanted to do this retrospective. One is that we so frequently see stories defined by their tropes. We see this in marketing. We see this as a means to try and quickly convey to somebody what something is about without maybe revealing too much, because a lot of people in reading a synopsis feel like, okay, now I feel like I read half the book. Is there any way I can know a little bit about it without being told too much? And sometimes in a good way, people can utilize tropes to try and describe something to someone without revealing too much beforehand. However, I do think that we have so much short form content these days, and we also are so quick to try and put things in a box. And oftentimes when we do that, we're not allowing for things, and especially our characters, to be messy. We're not allowing for maybe authors to subvert certain expectations and subvert certain tropes. We just, the second we get a tiny, tiny whiff of something, we just immediately say that is what this is, and then we don't take the time to unveil what perhaps is actually being said, and we don't necessarily give authors the chance. And I fear that authors are then going to come away from this deciding, well, maybe I shouldn't even try, because it feels like even though I put the work in, and even though I was trying to show the ways in which characters can be messy and the way characters can be flawed, just like we as human beings are, the way we as a society can be, the way that the whole world is, even though I want to try to put that in my work, it just feels like I can't, because it doesn't seem like readers want that. And so I think a lot of times it's what's leading to a lot of stories feeling like it's just for fun, it's just for entertainment, I just want to turn my brain off. And I always say there is a place for things that are more entertainment driven, and there is a place for things where you just kind of relax, enjoy, because life can be difficult and there are different forms of art, there's different forms of entertainment. that can serve different purposes for us. So by no means am I saying that there is no place for things that are more fun and lighthearted, or that are maybe more just for the pure entertainment factor. There is a place for those things. I just always consistently want to ensure that we also have the kinds of stories that are doing the really, really heavy lifting when it comes to analyzing society, analyzing our own behaviors. I want those kinds of things to be continuously engaged with. And as readers, I think it's important for us to do our part as well. A few questions, though, for all of you as we wrap this up. First off, is there a book that you feel like is using the concept of Not Like Other Girls, but in a way that is interesting and actually really, really challenging? Second, what is a time where you feel like somebody applied this label to a work and you felt like it was unfair? If you can think of a specific book that happened with, I would love to know. And then third, is there any other trope that you think it would be interesting to do this kind of deep dive retrospective with? Because I do feel like how tropes transform and how we go from loving something to hating something is really interesting to dissect. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.